from this person, an email saying, I know where her body is and who the kidnapper is.
Who exactly is behind the ransom notes? We really need to ask these questions. These messages may look like just another tip, another person claiming to know something, but then they always come back, again and again. Same voice, same claims, and each time, the tone changes. At one point, they say they saw Nancy alive. Later, they say she's already dead. These people are asking for money. Next thing, they say they're being ignored and are insisting they're not a scam. And the more they speak, the less clear it becomes. Because now the question isn't just what happened to Nancy, it's this. Who keeps sending these messages? And why do they sound like they're getting more desperate? We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything. In the Nancy Guthrie case, multiple ransom notes have surfaced. Some may be real, others clearly don't match. But among all of them, one pattern keeps repeating. A single sender, not claiming to be the kidnapper, but claiming to know who it is. They've contacted the media more than once, repeated the same story, changed key details, and continued. Even when no one responded, this isn't just about what they're saying. It's about how they're behaving and what that behavior might reveal. First of all, we are looking at another message that just came in. Not from law enforcement, not from the family, from someone else. And interestingly, it was sent to the media. TMZ. And at first, it looked like something the media had already seen before. Another tip. Another person claiming to know something about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. That part wasn't unusual. In a case like this, messages come in constantly. People speculate, people guess, people insert themselves into the story. Most of those messages don't go anywhere. But this one felt different. Not because of how long it was, not because of how detailed it was, but because of what it claimed. The sender didn't say, I think I know what happened. They didn't say, I heard something. They said something much more direct. They said they knew who took her, and they didn't frame it as a possibility. They stated it like a fact. I know who took her. That line changes the weight of this very message, because now, this isn't someone speculating. This is someone positioning themselves close to the truth. But then, just as quickly as they step toward the center of the case, they step back. They don't claim responsibility. They don't say they were involved. They don't say they were there. Instead, they are trying to draw a line. They are trying to separate themselves from the act itself. They don't want to be seen as the person who took Nancy, but someone who knows who did. An observer and an outsider. At least, that's how they present themselves. And then comes the next part. They don't offer the information freely. They attach a condition. Payment in Bitcoin. They're not trying to fix a negotiation or a conversation. This is a requirement. If you want to know what they know, you have to pay for it. And that changes the tone again, because now, this isn't just a message, it's a transaction, information, in exchange for money. But even that isn't what makes it stand out the most. It's where they chose to send it, not to investigators, not to a tip line, not to the people actively working the case, to the media, straight up public and visible. Almost like the sender wanted this to be seen, not just received, but noticed. And when you put all of that together, someone claiming direct knowledge, refusing to go through law enforcement, asking for payment, choosing visibility over privacy, it doesn't feel random again. It starts to feel intentional. Like this person didn't just have something to say. They knew exactly where to say it. And that raises a question that we need an answer to. If they weren't involved, how did they know exactly where to insert themselves into the story? At first, this could have been dismissed. A single message can be ignored, even one that sounds convincing. Because in cases like this, People come forward all the time. They say they know something. They say they've seen something. And when nothing comes back to them, they disappear. That's usually how it works. But this didn't follow that pattern. Because after the first message, nothing happened. No confirmation, no response, no payment, just silence. And that's where most people stop. But this person didn't. They came back, not with something completely new, not with proof, but with the same position, repeated. They still claimed to know who was involved, still held onto the same story, still asked for the same kind of payment. And when nothing came from that, they didn't stop there either. They returned again and again, reappearing just enough to stay present, just enough to remind anyone watching that they were still there, still waiting, still expecting something to change. And that behavior stands out because it breaks the usual pattern. Most false leads fade when they're ignored. Most opportunistic messages disappear when there's no response. But this one doesn't. It holds its position, repeats itself, stays active without being reinforced. And over time, that persistence starts to feel intentional. This is not someone testing a theory. This is someone maintaining a stance, someone who doesn't need a response to continue, someone who isn't reacting but insisting. And this is creating a different kind of tension. Because now, it's not about what they said the first time. It's about the fact that they didn't stop saying it, even when nothing came back, which leads to a question that becomes harder to ignore the longer it continues. Why would someone keep coming back if they weren't getting anything in return? Up to this point, the sender has been consistent about one thing. They claim to know, not guess or assumption knowledge. In one of the messages, the claim even becomes something more specific and direct, more difficult to ignore. Because instead of saying they know who took Nancy, they say something else. I saw her alive, with them. This is a short sentence, but it changes everything because now they're not just someone with information. They're placing themselves inside the event, close enough to see her, close enough to know she was still alive, and close enough to say it with certainty, not, I think she was alive, not, I heard she was alive. I saw her. And this matters a lot because it removes distance and speculation and replaces it with presence. And then there's the location. Sonora, Mexico. That's where they say she was. Not vaguely across the border, not an unknown place, a specific region. They named it directly. And again, they were not presenting it as a possibility. They were presenting it as fact, which creates a very clear image. A person claiming they were close enough to see Nancy alive in a specific location with the people responsible. And that level of detail does something. It pulls the message closer to reality, because the more specific something sounds, the harder it becomes to dismiss completely. But at the same time, it raises the stakes, because now the claim isn't just bold, it's verifiable, or at least it should be, right? Someone who saw her in a real place with real people should leave something behind, a trail, a lead, a way to follow it. But none of that comes with the message. No evidence, no names, no proof that places them there. Just the statement, repeated with confidence and left hanging, which creates a gap between what they claim and what they can show. And that gap is where the question starts to grow. Because if someone was truly that close, close enough to see her, close enough to know she was alive, then they weren't just near the story. They were inside it. Now the question becomes, if they were that close enough to see her, why weren't they identified earlier? What do you think? If you pay attention to the message, you'll notice something. First, they place themselves close enough to the situation to say, Nancy was alive. And for a moment, that creates a kind of stability. Because even if nothing is confirmed, at least the story holds. At least it stays the same. But then they switch. Because in a later message, the sender says something completely different. They say Nancy is dead. No buildup, no transition, no explanation for what changed. Just a new outcome, replacing the old one. And the shift is even too sudden from the way I see it. One moment, they're describing seeing her alive. The next, they're speaking as if that's no longer true. And there's nothing connecting those 2 points. No timeline, no indication of when this happened, no detail about what changed between those messages. Just a statement, delivered with the same certainty as before. And that's where the tension starts to turn. Because when someone claims something that's serious, you expect the story to expand, to add detail, to explain something, at least to show how they know. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the structure stays the same, a claim, delivered with confidence, without anything behind it. And when you place both versions side by side, they don't build on each other. They cancel each other out. Completely. Alive and then dead. 2 outcomes from the same person, with nothing in between. And that creates a break in the narrative, not just uncertainty, but contradiction. What exactly are they trying to do? Because now it's no longer about whether the sender knows something. It's about whether their story can hold it all. And once that doubt is there, everything else they've said starts to shift with it. Because if one part can change that easily, then none of it is fixed, none of it is stable. Which leads to a question that sits right at the center of it. Did something actually change? Or did their story? Another thing we need to pay attention to is what exactly is their motive? Up to this point, the sender has been focused on one thing, what they know, what they've seen, what they claim to understand about what happened. But underneath all of that, there's something else running through every message, a request. They are not implying or suggesting they are being direct. They want to be paid. And the way they ask for that payment starts to raise its own set of questions. Because the amount they're asking for isn't what you'd expect. It's not millions. It's not even close. What they're asking for is roughly half a Bitcoin. At the time, somewhere around $30,000 to $35,000. A specific number. Small enough to feel achievable. But when you place that number next to what's already available, it doesn't fit. Because as we already know, there's already a reward on the table. Over $1 million. Publicly known and accessible to anyone who can provide real, verifiable information. And yet, the sender doesn't move toward it. They don't contact investigators. They don't attempt to claim the larger reward. They ignore it completely. And instead, they stay where they are, sending messages to the media, asking for less, which shifts the dynamic entirely. Because now, it's not just about money. It's about how they're trying to get it. They don't go through official channels. They don't position themselves as someone cooperating with an investigation. Instead, they stay outside of it, at a distance, and they try to justify that distance. They say they don't trust law enforcement, that going through the FBI isn't safe, and that Hay won't be protected. So instead, they create their own path. Media to message to payment, no oversight, no verification, no requirement to prove anything before being paid. And that's where the structure of the request becomes sketchy. They're not offering proof first. They're asking for payment first, framing it as the only way the truth can come out. But as time passes, nothing changes. The Bitcoin wallet they provided remains empty. No transaction, no movement, no indication that anyone has accepted the offer. And the information they claim to have stays exactly where it is, unproven, unverified, locked behind a request that hasn't been fulfilled, which shifts the question again, away from what they know and toward how they're operating. Because if someone truly had information that could move the case forward, You would expect them to use the path that leads somewhere. Instead, they're choosing the one that doesn't. So we are now forced to ask if this about helping or getting paid first. Now, let's pay attention to their tone, because all of this is important if we want to follow through with the kind of person who is behind the ransom notes. At the beginning, the sender sounds certain, controlled. They speak like someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The claims are direct. The wording is steady. There's no hesitation. They don't try to convince anyone. They just state things, as if they expect to be believed. But that tone doesn't stay consistent. Over time, something starts to shift. It's subtle at first. Small changes in wording, slight differences in how things are phrased. So, although the confidence is still there, but now it feels like it's being pushed, like it needs to be reinforced. And then it changes again. The messages become more defensive. Instead of just stating what they know, the sender starts reacting. "I'm not a scam." That line appears not once, but more than once. And that changes the position they're in. Because now, they're not just delivering information, they're responding to doubt, trying to correct how they're being seen. And once that happens, the tone shifts again. This time, it tightens. Frustration starts to come through. "I'm being ignored." They're not listening. The wording becomes sharper, less controlled, more emotional. And that progression matters because it shows something changing behind the message. At first, they didn't need to explain themselves. Now, they do. At first, they spoke with certainty. Now, they're trying to defend it. And as that shift continues, the structure of the messages starts to loosen. The control they had early on begins to slip. The tone becomes uneven, more reactive, more urgent, but in a different way. Not the kind of urgency tied to the situation, but the kind tied to being heard. And that distinction is important, because now the pressure isn't coming from the case, it's coming from them, from how they're being received, from whether anyone is paying attention. And when you look at that progression from start to finish, confident to defensive to frustrated, it stops feeling like a steady source of information and starts feeling like someone trying to hold their position as it begins to weaken. Which leads to a question that sits just beneath everything they're saying. Why does someone claim to have real information? Sound like they're starting to lose control. As the messages continue, something new starts to appear. Not about Nancy, not about the kidnappers, but about who is behind the ransom note. At first, it's subtle, a line here, a phrase there, but over time, it becomes clearer. The sender begins to talk about risk, not in general terms, personally. They suggest that coming forward isn't safe, that speaking openly could put them in danger, that there's a reason they can't just walk into a police station and explain everything they claim to know. And that changes the position they've been holding. Because up to this point, they've presented themselves as someone with access, someone close enough to see, close enough to know, close enough to speak with certainty. But now, they're also positioning themselves as vulnerable, someone who has to be careful, someone who has to stay hidden. And we need to pay attention to this, because it starts to explain their choices. Why do they need to avoid law enforcement? Why do they have to go through the media? Why is everything being done at a distance? They're not just choosing that path. They're justifying it, framing it as necessary, framing it as protection. I could be in danger. That idea becomes part of the message, not proven, not supported with detail, but repeated enough to become part of how they want to be seen. And when you place that next to everything else, the claims of knowledge, the refusal to go through official channels, the need to stay hidden, it starts to form a pattern, not just of behavior, but of identity. Because now the sender isn't just someone with information, they're someone at risk because of it. Someone who knows something dangerous. Someone who can't come forward, even if they wanted to. But that introduces another layer of uncertainty, because that claim does two things at the same time. It explains their distance, and it protects it. It gives a reason for why they can't be verified, why they can't be questioned directly, why they need to remain just out of reach, and that makes it harder to separate what's real from what's being constructed, because if the risk is real, their behavior makes sense. But if it isn't, then the risk becomes something else entirely. A shield, a way to stay hidden without being challenged. And that leaves another question. Are they actually at risk or creating a reason to stay hidden? By now, these messages aren't just floating around online. They've been looked at closely. Investigators have gone through them, line by line, trying to understand what's actually there and what isn't. And the FBI is aware of this person. They've seen the messages. They've tracked when they come in. They've paid attention to how the story changes over time. So this isn't something happening outside the investigation. It's very much on their radar. But here's where it gets complicated. Even after reviewing everything, nothing has been confirmed. No identity, no location, no clear link between the sender and anything they're claiming. And more importantly, nothing they've said has led to any real action. No arrests, no searches based on their claims, no sign that investigators are treating this as something solid. Instead, it's being handled carefully. Not ignored, but not trusted either, just sitting in that middle space. Because when investigators look at something like this, they usually narrow it down to a few possibilities. One is that it's a hoax. Someone pulling bits of information together and presenting it in a way that sounds convincing, without actually knowing anything. Another possibility is that it's opportunistic. Someone watching the case, seeing the attention it's getting, and trying to benefit from it. Staying just believable enough to keep the conversation going without ever having to prove anything. But then, there's the third option. The one that keeps this from being dismissed entirely. That the person might actually be connected in some way. Not necessarily responsible, but close enough to know something real. Something partial, but not complete. And that's what makes this difficult, because even without proof, the consistency is still there. The messages don't disappear. They don't completely fall apart. They just stay unresolved. So investigators keep watching. They keep going back to the messages, looking for something that holds. Because in a case like this, ignoring something too early can be just as risky as believing it too quickly. And that leaves things in a strange position. Nothing confirmed, nothing ruled out, just still in play. Which brings up a question that's hard to shake. If none of this has been proven, why hasn't it been dismissed either? At a certain point, you stop focusing on what the messages say, and you start noticing what they do. Because every time one shows up, something shifts, not in the investigation itself, in the attention around it. A new message comes in, and suddenly, everyone is looking in a different direction. A new location gets mentioned, a new version of events gets introduced, and for a moment, that becomes the focus. People start trying to figure it out. They follow it. They question it. But then, before anything is confirmed, another message appears, and everything moves again. The last idea doesn't get answered. It just gets replaced. And if you watch that happen a few times, you start to notice the pattern. Nothing ever fully develops. Nothing gets closed. It just keeps shifting from one claim to another to the next. And over time, that does something subtle. It keeps the case active but never settled. There's always something new to look at, always another angle to consider, but nothing that actually lands, nothing that holds long enough to move things forward. And that's where it starts to feel different. Because now it's not just about information, it's about direction. Where people are looking, what they're focusing on, what they're spending time trying to figure out. And every time a message comes in, that direction changes. Not dramatically, just enough. Just enough to pull attention somewhere else. And when that keeps happening, you have to start asking a different kind of question, not just whether the messages are true, but what effect they're having. Because if every new message pulls focus away from the last one, then the case isn't really progressing. It's circling, staying in motion without getting closer to anything solid. And that leaves something sitting just under the surface. Not loud, but hard to ignore once you see it. Are these messages actually helping people understand what happened, or quietly steering attention away from something that matters more? So, what does all these point to? At this point, the focus shifts one last time, not on the messages themselves, but on the person behind them. Because even without a name, you can start to feel a pattern in how they operate, the way they show up, the way they speak, the way they adjust. And when you look at that as a whole, it starts to suggest a few different directions. One way to read it is that this is someone on the outside, someone watching everything unfold in real time, picking up pieces as they become public, then feeding them back in, just refined enough to sound convincing, not completely made up, but not grounded enough to be verified either, just enough to stay relevant, without ever being pinned down. But then, there's another way to look at it, that maybe this isn't someone completely outside. Maybe they're closer than they appear. Not directly involved, but not far away either. Close enough to know fragments, details that haven't been fully explained, but are being presented like they are. And that would explain why some parts of what they say feel steady, even when other parts shift. It doesn't completely fall apart. It just never fully comes together. And then there's a different possibility entirely, that this isn't really about information at all, that it's about presence, someone who keeps inserting themselves into the story, not because they control it, but because they want to be part of it. And over time, that becomes the pattern. Not just what they're saying, but the fact that they keep coming back to say it, that they stay in the conversation, that they don't disappear. And the truth is, each of these explanations fits something, but none of them explain everything, because no matter which direction you follow, there's always something missing. The certainty without proof, the access without identity, the consistency without confirmation. And through all of that, the sender is still there, still showing up, still speaking, still just out of reach, not fully inside the case, but not outside it either. And that's where things are left. Right in that space between knowing and not knowing, where the messages continue, but the person behind them never fully comes into focus. And that leaves one last question. If this person truly knows what happened, is he right to still stay within the shadow? Especially with something as important as this. We share the best true crime stories. Follow us to stay updated.